Hi and welcome. My name is Trent Nessler and I'm a physical therapist. And today I'm going to be talking to you about return to sport after an ACL reconstruction. And really, how do we use the current research and technology to make a more informed decision? Obviously, this is a very hot topic in sports medicine. And it's actually a topic that I personally take very close to my heart, and something that I've really spent the last 25 years really trying to make better and more informed decisions based on the most current research. Just a little background on myself. I'm a physical therapist, sports physical therapist. I've been in practice for over 25 years, and I've been treating ACLs really for over 20 years. Actually got into researching ACL prevention, have published some research in this area, and along this journey, actually developed a wearable sensor technology that is used across the country. We have over 450 systems across the country that measures biomechanics on athletes. And it's used both for return to play, but also as a part of baseline physicals to tell who's at risk for an ACL, a non-contact, specifically non-contact ACL injury. Also, as an athlete myself, I also try to bring that perspective. So, when we're looking at this, we're not just looking at it from a biomechanical standpoint, not just from a clinical standpoint, but really providing our athletes with meaningful information to help them stay on the field and help them return to the field safely. So one of the things I wanted to throw out there, because this really has a lot of application with some of the things that we're doing, is this clinical commentary that was published in 2021 by Timothy Hewitt. Obviously, we know the name. He's very well published in the ACL literature. And this was a clinical commentary on how data, how technology is allowing us to capture mass amounts of data, and how that data in the mass amounts that we're collecting is really going to start to drive some of the research, how it's going to drive our knowledge base more so even now than some of the research. The reason being is that with technologies and the way that some of these technologies function, what it's allowing us to do is capture data that would take a biomechanics lab, quite honestly, 10 years to collect. And that's really kind of where my wheelhouse has been really for the last, since 2017, and looking at the data that we collect. So just as a really quick summary, the system that we use, we've used it on over 30,000 athletes across the US. It collects 1,500 data points for every single assessment that we do. So what this has allowed us to do is in a very short period of time is collect 45 million data points related to human movement. And when you have that many data points, what it allows you to see is some common trends. So some of the things I'm going to talk to you about today, I'm going to have a lot of published research, a lot of evidence behind a lot of the things that I talk about. Some of the things I'm also going to talk about is some of the things that we're seeing in our data that's not quite published yet, but I wanted you to understand where I'm actually getting that from. So just some of the things that it's teaching us. Number one is speed of valgus matters. So if you were to stand up right now and you were to take your knee into 20 degrees of dynamic valgus, probably not going to hurt you. But if you did that at 250 degrees per second, you're probably going to tear something. And so one of the things that we measure is we actually measure speed of dynamic valgus, and it really tells us a lot of information about someone's risk. We also know that pelvic control often leads to a loss of balance. When someone's pelvis is moving in a single, especially in single limb activities, when someone's pelvis is moving in single limb activities, that changes the center of mass, which often leads to an athlete losing control and losing balance. Kinesiophobia, fear of movement, is really big, has a huge impact. I'm going to cite some studies related to that, and I'm going to share with you some of the things that we're seeing with kinesiophobia. And then finally is the impact of concussion on movement. We know from McPherson and others, McPherson published a paper in 2018, and I'll cite that paper in just a few moments, and about the impact that has on ACL risk specifically, but also lower extremity risk. And then I'll share with you some of the things that we're seeing related to concussion and when assessing human movement. So why am I so driven to change? Because the stats are just sad. I've been in practice since 1997, and these stats, despite all of the literature we've had, besides all the knowledge that we've gained, these stats, just quite honestly, they have not changed. There's over 807 1,000 lower kinetic chain injuries in athletics every year, over 200,000 plus, depending on what paper you look at. It can be anywhere from 200 to 300,000 ACL injuries every single year. It's over a $5 billion healthcare cost. And sadly, 79% of these are going to develop some form or another of osteoarthritis in the next 12 years. So that 12-year-old who has an ACL reconstruction, by the time they're 24, they're already starting to get some osteoarthritis. So what is that going to mean for them when they're 30, 40, 50 years old? So, this to me is like, why are we not doing something about this? This is truly an epidemic, and we really need to really take a deep dive into the research about what we should be looking at. And more importantly is, how is this affecting kids? This Wiggins study from 2016, it's a little bit older study, showed that 1 in 4 kids who tear their ACL are likely to suffer another one in their athletic career. As a parent, I don't want to see that. We got to get better at this. This was one of the studies in 2014 by Rugg that actually really drove me to do more about this. And that is that if an athlete has an ACL reconstruction, they're 8 times greater risk for a team during their athletic career. They're also going to be significantly more expensive from a medical perspective for the team. They're also more likely, they're 50% more likely to spend time on the DL. This means that the team's going to spend more money on them, and the athlete's going to contribute less to the game. What does that mean? That means the likelihood of them getting that scholarship after an ACL reconstruction is going to be weighed upon the decision a little bit more harshly than it has been in the past. This other study from 2022 is, 70% return to sport with 87% chance of feeling stable. So only 87% chance feeling stable with 70% that return. The question is are they returning to the same level of sport? And when we look at the studies related to, do you actually return to the same level of performance? What the studies would tell us is, no, you really don't. This is a study from 2017, which looked at NFL players, NBA, NHL, and Major League Baseball players. And what it found was that NFL players, they actually, not only did they shorten their career by 2 years, they decreased their performance up to 2 years after the ACL reconstruction. So the sad part is they did not actually return to their formal level of performance up till 2 years after that ACL reconstruction. So, knowing that football players, NFL players' careers are already short, this can have a significant financial impact on the player themselves, but also the team that player is playing for. This other study was a systematic review, which basically looked across all of the different papers and found that no matter what sport you look at, when you look at ACLs and you look back return to play, the performance is just not the same. So it drives home 2 things. Number one, we got to get better at making more informed decisions for return to play. How do we set that athlete to perform more optimally? How do we optimize their performance? How do we optimize their movement? How do we optimize the outcome? Number one. And number two, how do we prevent them from ever having that injury in the first place? And more importantly, how do we reduce their risk once they've had that injury? So this was another study from 2020 that looked at the impact on career length, and what the mean length after return to sport was 2.8 seasons, meaning that there was a significant percentage of players who had a significant reduction in their career length, and performance just, again, was not the same. So again, this just kind of tells us more and more things that we should be, more and more evidence that we should be really concerned about. How do we return an athlete to play? Are we returning them too soon? You have these accelerated protocols now, which across the country, some places are returning athletes in 6 months, some at 9 months, some at 12 months. If you follow Timothy Hewitt, he says that we probably shouldn't be returning for 2 years. I don't know anybody in the world that's going to do that, but it just gives you an idea of where the literature is falling as far as when should we be returning somebody to play. So this was a study that was done by Myers in 2005, looking at 3D motion analysis of vertical jump, 1 rep max squat, single leg hop. They did a 6-week training protocol where they increased core training, single limb training, plyometrics, and balance. And what they found is that when you improve biomechanics, not only do you reduce risk, but you improve athletic performance. Now, this is the crux of what I'm going to be talking about, because what I will tell you is that as a biomechanist, coming from this from a biomechanical standpoint, is we all know that if you improve the way someone moves, you improve the way the body attenuates force, which simply means you put less stress on the tissues, which means that you're less likely to get injured. Number 2 is that we know that if we improve the biomechanics of the system, that the kinetic energy transfer across that system is going to be much greater, which means that force output is going to be better, sprint speed is going to be better, overall strength is going to be better. So this is 2005. We're in 2023. We've known this for a very long time, but yet if you look at the way that we currently do things, we don't take all of this into consideration. So have we figured this out? So I'm a physical therapist by trade, and I am probably one of the harshest critics of my own profession. And what these next 2 studies have shown me is that we do not know what we're doing from a PT standpoint. These 2 studies looked at ACL reconstructions. This King study from 2019 looked at ACL reconstructions at 9 months, at what time they are ready to return to play. They have seen a sports certified physical therapist. They've gone through a typical ACL protocol, and now they're being returned to play. And what the study showed was at 9 months, not only was their bilateral vertical drop jump test and their single drop jump test significantly altered, so was their single leg hop. Most significantly, they showed the pathokinematics, or bad movement patterns, that are highly associated with ACL risk. And this is at 9 months. This is the time when the athlete is going back to return to sport. So what this told me is that we have got to get better at our rehab. We have got to start looking at this biomechanics earlier in the rehab process. Number 1, we have to quantify it. Take the eyeball out of it, because we're not so good at looking at biomechanics. What we need to do is leverage technology so we can record those biomechanics and develop better exercise programs to actually address it. And then this study told me, you know what, even at 2 years post-op ACL reconstruction, even though bilateral may balance out, so a bilateral hop or a bilateral squat may start to balance out. What this study shows is that even at 2 years post-op ACL reconstruction, despite having rehab, that the biomechanics that are associated with risk are still there. So these things don't self-correct each other. So that again, it tells me this has got to be corrected in the rehab process. It's got to be corrected in the strengthening conditioning protocol. It's got to be addressed with our strength and conditioning that we do with our athletes after ACL reconstruction. And most importantly, we have to quantify it in order to change it. Again, this is just stuff that keeps telling me we have to quantify this. What we're currently doing is not working. So this is a study from 2016. It was a systematic review, basically looking at what should we be looking at? So number 1, psychological measure. We should include, for ACL reconstruction, some form of a psychological measure to see how the athlete actually feels from a confidence standpoint about them, their limb, their stability, their ability to make cutting movements and things like that, because it guides us both from a psychological standpoint, but from a training perspective as well, how we can go ahead and address that. It also laid out a battery of tests. We also need to measure single limb performance. Sports is single limb. When you run, it's single limb. When you're hopping, it's single limb. When you're landing, it's single limb. And if you look at the ACL injuries, the non-contact injuries, most of those happen in a single limb performance. So we've got to do some form of training. The acronym there, LSI, is Limb Symmetry Index. That's basically how does your right side compare to your left side. And what the studies show is that all of those need to be within 90%. So whatever you're measuring, whether you're measuring quad strength, right and left, they got to be within 90%. Hamstring strength, right and left, it's got to be within 90%. Single leg hop, got to be within 90%. So if we do all this, we should be good to go. This is what, when I first read that, okay, if we do all this stuff, we should be good to go. And what this study did, this was Toole's study from 2017, came out the very next year. And it said, here's all the criteria. Here's what the studies are telling us. We should have an IKDC of 90% or better. We should have an LSI of 90% or better for quad and hamstring strength, for single leg hop, triple hop, crossover hop, 6 meter time test. We should all be within 90% of that. Well, you know what? When you do that with athletes, only 13.9% passed all of that criteria. 43 to 78% passed some of it, but not all of it. So again, that goes back to number one, are we measuring the right things? And number two, from a rehab perspective, are we preparing them for this? At what stages should we prepare them for? And what kinds of things should we be doing? What kinds of things should we be looking at? So this was really an eye opener for me. So limb symmetry index is something that I've been using for a very long time. I've always used comparison of right side to left side. Part of the problem is that number one, I'm assuming that the limb I'm comparing to has good biomechanics, number one. Number two, I'm assuming that limb that I'm comparing to is not completely deconditioned during the ACL rehab process. Those are two very bad assumptions, because I think we've all seen the athlete who jumps and both knees knock in towards midline. So if their right side, which is the reconstructed side, moves in just as badly as their left side, they're 100% LSI. So in that case, they're good to go. And I think any of us talking in this would say, well, no, that's stupid. That's crazy. If they get bad biomechanics, just because it's the same as the other side does not mean they're ready to go. And that's exactly what the REN study showed. And it said basically that you can have 90% LSI and you can still have really cruddy movement. So this was a study that looked at single leg hop from 2020, basically comparing the single leg hop test alone as a kind of a measure for return to play. The gist of this is that when you compare the single leg hop to an IKDC and a KUS and ability to return to sport, there was only a fair association with risk with the IKDC, the KUS, and the single leg hop. So single leg hop alone, take away from this slide, single leg hop alone is not enough. So a lot of this functional testing that we do, part of the problem is, in my opinion, is that we rely too much on our eyes. We rely way too much on the human eyeball to accurately measure someone's biomechanics when they're landing. And what I can tell you, based on our data, is that sometimes that valgus occurs at such a rapid speed that you're not going to catch it. You're not going to catch it with your eyeball. Your eyeball only functions at so many frames per second. It's around 200 frames per second. When you got technology that's capturing at 250 frames per second, that's a big difference in what you're able to see and what you're not able to see. This is a study from 2021, basically looking at functional performance tests. In this particular study, they looked at the Star Excursion Balance Test, SEBT, single leg hop. They looked at a single leg hop for distance, a drop vertical jump bilateral, and a tuck jump. And basically looked at those and then tried to follow these athletes for 19 months later to see if those were good predictors of injury risk. And sadly, they found that they were not they were fair predictive. They had a fair predictive value. And in the world of research, fair is not good. So in my mind, again, this just tells me we got to get better at this. We got to get better measures for looking at return to play. So this is a symmetry in the triple hop from 2022, looking at and they looked at a bunch of athletes, 24 ACL reconstructed. They compared them to match controls. They went through those that were return to play, had surgeon and PT clearance. They completed a sport-specific field training, which was different, was not real clear on what all that was. And then they had an LSI of quad for their quad strength and for their hop test. And they had a 97% LSI in the distance hopped, and 80% symmetry in knee biomechanics. And what they found is that when they looked at them biomechanically, there was still a lot of biomechanical risk factors. So that being said, again, a lot of times we use a single leg hop, we use a single leg triple hop, but what are we measuring? We're measuring a couple of things. Number one is it symmetrical distance? Is it symmetrical from an appearance? Does it look the same? Is it the same time? However, what happens is, one, we may be comparing that to an altered, horrible limb, right? They may be equally bad, number one. And two is there's error when we use our eyeballs to really try to quantify the biomechanics that put people at risk. So I put this in here because this is a really hot topic around concussion and increased risk for lower extremity injuries. So there's a lot of studies out there. It started really in 2015 with studies starting to show that there's a risk after a concussion and that there's an impact on not only performance, but there's also an impact on the way that somebody moves. The Howell study from 2015 that you see there was really one of the first ones that I saw that was showing that there was a change in the center of mass just with walking. Just with walking, when an athlete had suffered a concussion up to 2 months post that concussion, their center of mass still moved a lot when they walk. So that was kind of like an aha thing and something that we need to work on post concussion. This Brooks study showed that Division I athletes who were multi-sport athletes who had a concussion were 2.4 times greater risk for a lower extremity injury after return to sport. So this was kind of like the first one that was like, holy cow, like there's an association with concussion and lower extremity risk. But really, the Gilbert study for me was one of the major first ones in 2016 that showed that Division I athletes who had a concussion were at a greater risk for knee injuries and lateral ankle sprains. The p-value, which should be 0.05 or a strong 0.05 for a strong, significant correlation of those, had a p-value of 0.002 for knee injury and 0.012 for lateral ankle injuries. And what that means is it's really strong. You're 1.6 to 2.9 times greater risk for a lower extremity injury up to 2 years post-concussion. McPherson, twice, 2018 and then again in 2020, showed the same thing. In the last study, he looked at over 4,000, almost 5,000 subjects, and found that you're at 1.6 times greater risk for an ACL injury up to 3 years after a concussion. That's nuts, right? So the first thing that goes through my mind is like, why the heck is that? Why is these athletes at greater risk? Because in the clinic settings that I've worked in, we do a lot of vestibular work. We do a lot of neck work. We have them work with strobes and we have them work, their cardiovascular up to symptoms and things like that. But we never really knew this. And if there's some reason or something that we can identify that we should be training, that's a totally different thing. So this was actually a really interesting study. It was done in 2019. It looked at dynamic stability and concussion. And what they found in this study is that those who lacked dynamic stability, they call it dynamic stability, and that is really stability of the pelvis and the lower extremity. What they found is that those who lacked dynamic stability of the pelvis and control of that frontal plane motion of their knee were at 3 times greater risk of a concussion during a sport. And those who actually improved that strength, who improved that stability, actually were less likely to get concussed. So what does that tell me? That tells me something I need to work on. I need to work on single leg squats, for example, and really make sure they're controlling their pelvis. So their pelvis is not dropping down when they're doing a single leg squat, and they're controlling that frontal plane motion of their knee during single leg squats. So again, what I always look for is, okay, so what is the research telling me, and how can I apply this to a training program that I do? So this is a study from just this year that looked at return to sport post-concussion. And this study is really starting to show some of the things that we're showing. And that is that athletes who have less neuromuscular control are at a much greater risk for injury. So when doing a single leg squat, if you look at the one with the green check mark, that's what they should look like versus the X, where they're not only, if you look at the pelvis is falling down and the knee is moving into a dynamic valgus. And frankly, that's the same thing that we're seeing. So we have a large data set. Like I told you, we've done over 30,000 athletes across the US. We actually track concussion as a part of our data intake. And one of the things that we see, a couple of things that we see, number one is that athletes who've had a concussion, they tend to corkscrew more at their hip. What does that mean? Their hips drop and then it rotates. So the easiest way to see this is when they're doing a single leg squat, if their opposite foot goes out and behind them and you see it pop out on the other side, you know that they're rotating at the hips. So they're dropping and rotating at the hips. So that's one thing that we see. Another thing that we see is that they lose balance more. So when they're doing their single leg hops and things like that, they're not controlling their pelvis, and their center of mass is moving a lot. Just like the Gilbert study on a few slides ago, that they were seeing that in walking, we see it when they do single leg activities. So in a single leg activity, that their center of mass is moving a lot and they lose their balance. We also see an increase in corrective strategies. If I have somebody doing a single leg hop, the area of coverage or what we call time to stability, they hop up in the air, they land. A lot of times an athlete will jump up in the air and they land, they'll do a couple of hops. So the time from the very first hop to the time at which they stop and they're stable, that's called time to stability. What we see is that athletes who've had a concussion, they jump up, they land, they hop, 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 hop. Now they're stable. So the time to stability, the time that it takes them, the hops that it takes them to become stable increases. And we suspect that also puts them at a greater risk for injury. We also see that there's also those with concussion tend to have higher degrees of valgus at the knee during landing, and their speeds of valgus at landing are a little bit higher. So what does the literature tell us that we should be assessing? Number one, there's certain demographic factors, and I won't go into those too much, certain demographic factors that we should be looking at. Number two is that we should be looking at some form of a psychological measure. Now, two major ones that are out there for ACLs, there's the ACL RSI. This came out of Australia with Ann Weber. This is been used a lot in the research. The only thing is for me is I try to tie whatever psychological measure I'm going to look at, I want it tied to movement, and I want it tied to risk, and I want it tied to performance. And the ACL RSI, although it is a good psychological measure, this particular study was an aha moment for me because it had trivial or weak correlation with strength and power measures at 9 months. And there was an association, but not a strong association with risk with return to sport. So I'm going to put that aside. What else out there is there? What else can I look at? So the other one that I'm going to look at is the TSK-11, Tampa Scale for Kinesiophobia 11 form. The TSK-11 is the one that I use. And that really started in 2018 with Paterno. He showed that if you score 19 or greater on the TSK-11, you are 13 times more likely to be injured with return to sport. So the TSK-11 is highly associated with risk for return to sport. Check mark number one. Check mark number two is there is a direct association with kinesiophobia measured on this form, and some of the movement deviations that we see that put people at risk for an ACL injury. So this particular one, they did a drop jump, and what they found is that athletes who had a high level of kinesiophobia unloaded their involved side. So, and that makes a lot of sense because when they jump, they load to the opposite side, get the weight off the non-involved side. So we have a measure that we look at called a lateral shift. If I took a plumb line, dropped it from your cervical spine down to your sacrum and measured your hip from that center line during your squat, you should remain relatively equal distance from that plumb line. If not, you're shifting your weight one way or you're shifting your weight another way. We actually have a study going on right now with Matt Itherburn and ASMI in Birmingham, a multi-site study. We've got over 400 subjects where we're looking at the TSK11 and the association to a lateral shift. And what we're seeing, our preliminary data is showing us some very strong correlations, not only with lateral shift, but also with some other things that I'll be pointing out in just a moment. So people always tell me, always ask me, why do I do so much core testing? And that really is, for a long time, we've always known the correlation of a strong core to stability of the pelvis, to quad and hamstring strength, as well as control of frontal plane motion. We've known that, we've suspected that. 2021, we've got 2020, really, we started getting some really good studies out there. This one actually looked at core training and the impact on biomechanics. And what it found was that if you improve, specifically two of the tests that they put in there, planks and side planks, if you improve stability, time stability on those two tests, that you reduce your risk for ACL injuries threefold. This was another study that looked at planks and side planks from 2019, looking at poor core stability and lower extremity strength, and basically found the same thing, is that if you don't have good core stability as measured by these movements and others, that you're at a greater risk for not only a ACL injury, but a lower extremity injury. So planks and side planks, to me, is something that we need to measure. This is what the studies are telling me. We've also, if you look in this reference list here, going back as far as 2013, we showed that there was a correlation with Frank to ACL injuries. To the other author, we showed that there was a correlation to sprint speed, tongue to vertical jump. So again, core stabilization has a direct effect on performance and biomechanics. So we know that now. So it should be something that we look at. Squat. Obviously, bilateral squat is it's a functional movement. It's a movement we do in sport. It's a movement we train in the gym for sport. So it should be symmetrical. It also gives us a good indication of load bearing on one side or the other. So we call this a lateral shift when, again, what I told you about the plumb line, when someone shifts their weight off to one side, we say they have a lateral shift to that side. With the literature, 2013, this Atkins study basically calls that a lateral displacement of the pelvis during the squatting motion. Much more articulate than I. The concept is the same, is that if you shift your weight over to one side during a squatting motion, you have less EMG activity on one side, more on the other side. You have lengthening on one side, shortening on the other side. You have to have it symmetrical. Strength will never be, your LSI will never be 100% unless you correct that. And that, by far, a lateral shift is by far one of the biggest things that I see in athletes. I've seen athletes with a 3-inch shift their weight 3 inches over to one side during a bilateral non-weighted squat, then go into the gym and squat 315 pounds. You can only imagine the EMG activity one side versus the other side, the strength one side versus the other side, the loading of the spine, the knee, the hip, the ankle, all of that goes on with that type of a shift. So correcting a lateral shift is absolutely essential. Also, is where is your center of mass during that squat? We know from biomechanics that if you bring your center of mass far forward, like a front squat, what does that do? It gets more quad recruitment. There's that big controversy about quad to hamstring ratios. There's a controversy about quad dominance and the risk for ACL injuries. I firmly believe that if we can get people to squat correctly, get their center of mass where it should be during a squatting motion, we're going to have a more symmetrical loading of the quads to hamstrings. We're going to be much more towards that ratio that we should be. The other thing is single limb performance. And again, I could cite studies back from 2008 in here. Basically, studies have shown from Stearns was one of the first most powerful ones for me. This is when I was doing this all with 2D 2D slow motion technology. Basically, that study showed that even with video, that if you record somebody on slow motion video and you see frontal plane motion, that is equal to the adduction moment, which is equal to ACL risk. So frontal plane motion is critical. We now call that dynamic valgus. Back then it was called frontal plane motion. So we know that. We also know that it's a great indicator of performance. That if someone does not have stability in single limb performance, it's going to greatly affect their power output. It's going to affect their sprint speed, their vertical jump, their squats, etc. Dynamic valgus is the motion we should be looking at. These two studies, the first one was done on football players, NFL pro players. The other one was done on your recreational athlete. The concept is the same. No matter what your sport, no matter what age you are, dynamic valgus is a bad thing. Dynamic valgus, which is shown there, is what puts a lot of stress on the ACL and ends up causing the ACL to rupture. This is a systematic review showing that looking at what is the impact of fatigue. Now, if you ask Timothy Hewitt, what is the impact of fatigue on ACL risk? Don't go down that road. He's going to argue with you, because there is no studies out there that show that if you're fatigued, that you are at a greater risk for an ACL injury. However, fatigue studies have been out there for a long time. They've shown that you're at greater risk for ankle injuries. They've shown you're at greater risk for back injuries, for shoulder injuries. I feel like we just haven't shown it yet because we haven't recorded it right. We haven't figured it out yet, how to measure that for ACL risk. What I do know is that this study showed that if you are fatigued, all of the biomechanics that put you at risk for an ACL get worse. And more importantly, back in 2007, this study actually showed that if you're fatigued, your single limb biomechanics is awful. So even though the studies have not shown that there's a direct correlation to fatigue and ACL risk, I think it makes a lot of sense to all of us that this can happen. Again, some of the other studies showing that fatigue adds to foot injuries, ankle injuries, etc. We also know that frontal plane motion is greatly affected with fatigue. And if you want to find out some all of the factors that lead to ACL risk, you can my reference for my paper that was published in 2017 is right there, where we listed a plethora of things that put people at risk for ACL injuries. So things that we must consider. LSI alone is not enough. We have to look at demographic and historical data, history data. We need to look at kinesiophobia. We need to look at core stability, bilateral squat, dynamic valgus, and we need to have some level of fatigue. So this is what we do. We do a movement assessment in full transparency. This is the one that I had developed. It's called the Athletic Movement Index. It's 7 essential movements. We do a plank. We do 20 squats. We do a side plank right, side plank left. Why side plank? Side plank has the highest EMG activity for the glute medius. We want to fatigue the glute medius because then we want to do all single leg activities, which require the glute medius to be very, very active. We do a single leg squat. We do a single leg hop. We do a hop plant. They jump forwards, backwards, lateral, and medial. And then we do an ankle lunge test to clear the ankle to make sure that there's mobility there, and that's not something that's adding to the movement dysfunction that we're seeing. Then we repeat all of that on the left side. All of this is captured with a wearable sensor technology. These sensors that we use have IMUs in them. It's called inertial measurement unit, has a gyrometer, magnetometer, and accelerometer, and it basically captures motion, rotation, and acceleration data all within 3% of a Viacon system. So it allows us literally in 15 minutes to capture this information at 200 frames per second. It is relayed to the computer. The computer interprets that information and then prints us out a comprehensive report. This is what the plank looks like. This is what the technology looks like as it's recording the plank. This is one of our core tests. This is measuring both frontal and transverse plane stability. We want to see, do you flex and extend during the plank, or do you rotate during the plank? We found that rotation is actually one of the most detrimental things to stability. This one is measuring single limb stability, frontal plane stability during single leg hopping. This is just one of the motions. You can see how it's reading it out. The sensors are basically capturing all that. It's capturing not only what's the depth of the motion that they go through, but also how much dynamic valgus do they have, and what is the speed at which that dynamic valgus occurs. So here's a kind of a quick summary of all the things that we measure. We measure your stability of the during the planks and the side planks. We measure both your frontal plane motion, or I'm sorry, your lateral shift during the squat. We measure how much lumbar flexion do you get during the squat. We also measure single leg activities. We look for a lot of different things with your single leg activities. The other thing that we do measure is your LSI, right side to left side. But here's the big difference. We look at limb quality index. This is what we call LQI. So we not only look at, do you match to your right side to your left side? We also look to see, do you match within norms of what it should be? Because we now have data, enough data, that we can tell you in a single leg squat, your knee should not fall at a dynamic valgus greater than 20 degrees per second. In a single leg hop, it's 100 degrees per second. In a single leg hop, it's 135 degrees per second. And we know that if you fall at greater than 200 degrees per second in a single leg hop plant, that you're 3 times more likely to suffer a knee injury. So again, this is where mass data collection like this really comes into play. So this was a study that was done in 2020, Troy University, with our folks out there. Basically what they did is they applied this technology and using those movement assessments to provide a exercise program, and then measure the results of that. And you can see what those results are right there. One other piece that we add for return to play. So we, as a part of our return to play, we do the TSK11. Where do they measure on the TSK11? We look at their AMI. We look for certain measures within the AMI, and then we do an ACL decel test. So this is a 30-yard test, max acceleration to max deacceleration, all within 30 yards. The sensors actually record this the whole way. So it allows us to give us some very good feedback. And then you can see what the report looks like right there. What we look at is the average ground reaction force. We also look at the what's called the IPA, which is initial peak acceleration. And then we look at your average contact time on your right side versus your left side. Again, we're looking for some symmetry. We're looking how you're absorbing the load through your legs during both the acceleration and deacceleration phases of sprinting. So these are just some of the things that we look for our recommendations. We look to stability of the core in the frontal and transverse plane. We look for your symmetry and squatting, control of that frontal plane motion. We look for control of speed of that motion. And then we also look at your acceleration and deacceleration data. Do you have symmetry in your ground reaction force? Do you have a symmetry in your initial peak acceleration, which is when your heel contacts the ground? How are you absorbing that force? You can see this one right here. This demonstration right here is very far off. It should not be that far off. Should be symmetrical. And then what's your symmetry in contact time? So, what is your psychological measure? This is a movement assessment. So for our teams, what they'll do is they'll use this as kind of the return to play. And then they'll also add on top of that, their sport specific testing. So this is a biomechanical test. This is a movement test. This movement test does not change whether you play soccer, football, lacrosse, mixed martial arts, or whatever. It is the same. Why? Because if you look at the literature, dynamic valgus does not change if you're a soccer player, football player, a mixed martial artist, or a gymnast. Dynamic valgus is bad no matter what. So we specifically use a movement assessment to identify the movements that put you at risk. And then for our teams, they will add a sport-specific test to get some more sport-specific type of return to sport testing. So when should you do this? How often should you do this? I just threw this study in here because it really shows in order for you to get clinically meaningful improvement for movement assessments, they need to be done. You have to give at least 6 to 8 weeks of training in between your sessions. Now, one thing I will say is I would suspect that these numbers would change with BFR. Because BFR accelerates the strengthening phase, it accelerates muscle hypertrophy. I would suspect that if you're using BFR, you're probably going to see those changes at around 3 to 4 weeks. But what the research says is in normal conditions, you should give it about 6 to 8 weeks. So that's my presentation. I know I talked pretty fast there. I wanted to get through a lot of information. I went a little bit over the time. Hopefully it was worth it to you. The goal is really to provide you with the latest research on as it relates to biomechanics, as it relates to human movement assessment, and how we should be using human movement assessment to make more informed decisions for return to play. I've got my Instagram handle on there. You can always give me a follow. I do tend to publish or put out quite a bit of research in this area. It's an area of passion of mine. My other passion is mixed martial arts. So I also do a lot of stuff on mixed martial arts as well. So thank you very much for joining me today. Hope it was worth it. And thank you, everybody.